In the quiet of history, some shadows linger longer than others. They creep softly into our minds, not with the sound of thunder, but like a candle flickering in a cold, empty room. Tonight, we will trace one of those shadows, a life that shaped the world, yet left it trembling in ways both seen and unseen. Let us move gently into this story, allowing each whisper of the past to settle, calm, and guide us through the night. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too, as we wander softly through history, uncovering truths in the hush of darkness, where stories breathe quietly and lessons linger like starlight. The world remembers him for the storm he would unleash, but before the thunder came, there was only the hush of a small town, the quiet wind slipping through narrow streets, and the soft, fragile rhythm of a boy's footsteps. Linz, a town of cobbled lanes and frost-edged rooftops, held him as it holds any child, sometimes gently, sometimes with cold indifference. He walked beneath low-hanging clouds, watching smoke curl from chimneys, listening to the distant murmur of neighbors' lives. Nothing about those days promised greatness. Nothing whispered of the shadows he would cast. And yet, every glance, every observation, every tiny moment of wonder or frustration planted seeds that would grow in silence, invisible to those around him. The boy noticed everything. The way light fell across a frozen puddle in winter. The way adults spoke in murmurs, their words measured, weighted with unspoken truths. He absorbed the small injustices that seemed to follow people everywhere. The teacher's sigh at a late homework, the merchant's frown at a minor mistake, the cold glance of a stranger passing in the street. These details mattered to him in ways no one could see. They were not lessons in kindness or fairness. They were lessons in consequence, in the quiet power of observation, in the invisible ways the world rewards some and punishes others. Already, he learned that life measured more than effort. It measured attention, restraint, and the unspoken agreements we make with fear. At home, he felt a mixture of warmth and tension, the kind that leave a faint ache in a child's chest. His family was ordinary in the ways that matter, the kind of ordinary that carries both comfort and disappointment in equal measure. He watched adults perform their roles, silently, with precision or frustration, and wondered how the small moments of decision shaped their days, their reputations, their influence. Sometimes he imitated them, sometimes he resisted, but always he observed. The world was a classroom, and he was a patient student, learning the invisible rules that governed respect, attention, and survival. School was no different. In classrooms, the boy felt the subtle currents of competition, approval, and disdain. He noticed who was praised, who was ignored, and who was quietly feared. He felt the weight of expectation, both his own and that of others, and in the spaces between lessons he learned to hide what he felt. A frown, a tremor in his hand, the quick glance away from a teacher's eyes, each carried meaning. He understood, even as a child, that emotions were visible and visibility was dangerous. The softest quiver of doubt or hope could invite judgment, and the world, he began to realize, was full of those who would exploit it. Yet there were moments of wonder. He lingered before paintings, the colors of landscapes and portraits filling him with a quiet longing. He traced shapes with his gaze, imagining lives that existed beyond his own. Music floated through the streets sometimes, and he stopped to listen, feeling a small pulse of joy, fleeting yet potent. These moments, soft as they were teaching him another lesson, that beauty exists even where pain and struggle abound, and that awareness of the world's depth comes not only from observing cruelty, but also from sensing possibility. It was also a time of quiet loneliness. He could feel, with uncanny precision, how small he was in a town of adults, how transient and fragile a single human life could be. He carried his thoughts with him as a shield, sometimes heavy, sometimes comforting. He understood that the world measured more than intentions. It measured control. He began to craft his internal self carefully, learning how to manage impulses, to mask disappointment, and to feign compliance when necessary. Already, the faint outline of discipline was forming, though he would not have named it as such. He was learning the secret language of survival. In these early years, there were also frustrations, small and growing. Doors closed before he could enter. Voices ignored him. Opportunities slipped past unnoticed. Each moment, each quiet dismissal, became a lesson in persistence, patience, and quiet endurance. He noticed that life had a rhythm of its own, one that did not bend to desire or fairness. And so he practiced stillness, observation, and restraint, tools that would later serve him in ways no one could have imagined at the time. By the winter of his boyhood, the small lessons of streets, classrooms, and hearths converged. He understood, in a manner both intuitive and precise, that the world rewards the careful and punishes the visible. Every tremor of fear, every flicker of hope, every blush of anger could be noted, measured, and used against him. And though he was only a boy, he began to practice concealment, not yet knowing why, not yet imagining the future it would shape. But the instinct was there, as natural as breathing, the quiet, subtle awareness that survival, influence, and control come first to those who understand what the world cannot see. And so, as the night deepened over Linz, and stars blinked faintly above the quiet town, the boy walked home, his shadow stretching long on the cobblestones. He did not know that these quiet walks, these patient observations, these small experiments in self-control were the foundation of everything to come. He only knew, as children sometimes do, that the world was larger than his understanding, and that attention, patience, and silence were powerful allies. And in that understanding, as the wind whispered through empty streets, the first traces of a storm began to stir. The boy's world was small, but his mind roamed far beyond the borders of Linz. He began to understand patterns, the rise and fall of moods in the people around him, the fleeting alliances. Every smile could conceal calculation, every frown could mask intent, and every gesture could reveal more than words ever could. Slowly, the subtle art of reading the world became second nature. He noticed the pauses between words, the way the body shifted when someone lied, the almost imperceptible tremor in the hand of a person concealing fear. And with every observation, he felt a quiet thrill, a realization that knowledge could be a kind of power, and that power could be nurtured in silence. School lessons came and went, but he found himself more interested in the lessons life gave freely. He studied human behavior with the precision of an artist sketching a portrait, the tilt of a head, the narrowing of eyes, the hesitant step forward or the retreat in a glance. Each movement, each fleeting expression became a note in a private symphony that he alone could hear. He learned to catalog these notes, to interpret them, to anticipate them. By the time he was a young teenager, he could predict, with uncanny accuracy, how classmates and teachers would react in any situation. And while others struggled to understand each other, he moved like a shadow among them, careful, quiet, always observing, always learning. Yet even as he cultivated these skills, he carried an acute sense of isolation. To understand so deeply was to feel apart, to exist on the edges of relationships rather than within them. Moments of laughter felt distant, bonds of friendship sometimes fleeting. He watched, but he rarely revealed. The world demanded emotion, but he had learned early that showing too much invited intrusion. Every revealed weakness was a doorway through which others might enter, a vulnerability they could exploit. And so he perfected a mask of calm, a facade of neutrality that concealed the rich, turbulent world inside him. It was not cruelty, he reasoned, nor was it coldness. It was survival, the quiet fortification of a mind intent on mastery. At home, the tensions of family life provided another arena for subtle observation. Arguments erupted over small matters, money, chores, petty grievances, and he would sit silently, absorbing each nuance. He noticed the rise and fall of voices, the unspoken exchanges between his parents, the silent negotiations of power that passed beneath the surface of words. The household, like the town itself, was a miniature theater of strategy, and he the quiet audience, both participant and observer. He began to test himself, to practice restraint, learning when to speak and when to remain invisible, when to push and when to yield. Each success, each small victory in self-discipline, strengthened the sense that control, over self, over circumstance, was the first step towards something greater. Outside, the world was never static. Seasonal festivals brought noise and color. Strangers passed through, and rumors of events in distant cities drifted on the wind. He listened, absorbed, measured. He realized that life moved in currents, and those who failed to see them were carried along, tossed by circumstances rather than shaping them. Observation alone was not enough. One had to anticipate, to calculate, to act with precision. He began to imagine the world as a chessboard, each person a piece with visible and hidden strengths, each interaction a move in a game he was only beginning to understand. And in these quiet contemplations, the notion of power began to crystallize. Not power over others, but power over perception, over influence, over the currents that shaped events far larger than himself. Even leisure became instructive. He wandered through museums, lingered over portraits, and studied the histories of distant kings and generals. He read about ambition, conquest, loyalty, and betrayal. He felt the faint thrill of understanding that great men, those remembered in history, were not merely born to power, but learned its secrets through observation, restraint, and careful action. The lessons of history echoed the lessons he practiced daily: concealment, patience, discipline, and the quiet accumulation of insight. The world rewarded those who could master themselves before attempting to master others. He understood this instinctively, though it was only a seed waiting to grow. And yet, for all the foresight and careful observation, he still felt the stirrings of ordinary youth: anger, envy, fleeting moments of desire or longing. But he learned early that these emotions, while real, were instruments, not guides. To act on them without discretion was to invite misfortune. To hide them completely was to gain control. Each moment of self-restraint reinforced the quiet architecture of his mind, building a foundation that would later support the enormity of what he sought to command. Control was not given, he realized. It was earned in the silence between impulse and action, in the careful choreography of feeling and appearance. By the end of his adolescence, the boy who had wandered Lin's streets with eyes wide open had transformed into a young man of extraordinary perception. The quiet lessons of childhood had become instinct, a measured glance, a controlled tone, a body that betrayed nothing. And as he looked out over the town from a high ridge at dusk, the wind brushing against his face, he understood that the world would not reward honesty or innocence. It would reward mastery, and he was only beginning to understand what mastery demanded. The night fell around him, soft and unyielding. Shadows stretched long across rooftops. The air held the faint scent of smoke and frost, and the world continued its unobserved, relentless rhythm. And in the quiet, he felt the faintest stirrings of purpose, the first whispers of a destiny that would unfold in silence, calculation, and careful concealment. The boy who learned to feel everything and show nothing had begun his path, stepping into a world that measured power not in emotion, but in perception. Soft whisper transition. And so, as the stars blinked over Linz and the night carried the faint hum of distant streets, his journey moved quietly forward, carrying within it the first shadows of the storm to come. As he grew, so too did his awareness of the stories people told themselves. Every conversation, every whispered secret, every confession of fear or hope was an invisible thread in a tapestry he was learning to read. He realized that people were fragile in ways they never admitted, that even the strongest facade could crack under pressure, and that the world had a subtle, relentless way of exploiting those cracks. And so he practiced invisibility, Not a physical hiding, but a concealment of self, a soft camouflage in plain sight. To move unnoticed, to remain unread, to let others reveal themselves while he remained a silent observer. That became both a skill and a sanctuary. The streets, the cafes, the crowded classrooms, all became his laboratory. He watched how gestures influenced reactions, how slight hesitation or sudden confidence could tip the balance of an argument. He learned that power often moved quietly in imperceptible currents, rather than in grand gestures or loud declarations. Influence was a subtle thing. A glance here, a silence there, a careful arrangement of presence and absence. He began to understand that those who seemed most in control were rarely the loudest or the most aggressive. They were the ones who understood the flow of human behavior and moved within it, unseen, untouchable. Yet, this understanding brought with it a certain solitude. To read others so carefully was to know that few could read him. Relationships were filtered through observation, measured in what was said and what was left unsaid. Friendships became experiments, alliances became practice grounds, and family interactions were studied with the precision of a historian tracing the rise and fall of empires. He began to appreciate the weight of restraint, the quiet power of withholding, the way patience could bend outcomes without force. Every unspoken thought, every controlled gesture was a note in a symphony only he could conduct. At times, his mind drifted to historical figures, those who had commanded armies, shaped nations, or rewritten laws of power. He read of Julius Caesar, whose calm exterior in the Senate masked the storm of ambition and fear within. He studied Napoleon, whose letters revealed the fragile undercurrents behind public triumphs. He absorbed the lessons quietly. The world did not reward openness or purity. It rewarded calculation, concealment, and a mastery of self before attempting to master others. In these histories, he saw reflected a mirror of his own growing understanding, a quiet reassurance that his path, though lonely, was not without precedent. Every small victory in self-discipline reinforced the architecture of his mind. A controlled smile when anger threatened, a measured word when fear surged, a deliberate pause when impulse demanded speech, all became habitual. He began to notice how others responded to this invisible authority, subtle deference, hesitation, or surprise at his composure. Even the teachers who thought him unremarkable responded differently once they sensed a mind that moved independently of emotion. And slowly, imperceptibly, he learned that true power did not announce itself. It made its presence felt quietly, unmistakably, and irreversibly. The arts, too, became a study in restraint and revelation. He lingered over paintings in museums, noting how light and shadow revealed emotion while hiding intention. He read plays where silence conveyed more than dialogue, where the pauses between lines carried the weight of entire worlds. Music spoke to him in patterns and crescendos, the ebb and flow of tension and release echoing the rhythms he observed in human behavior. He realized that life itself was a composition, and those who mastered its tempo and harmony could shape outcomes without coercion, without spectacle. But the lessons were never purely academic. Encounters with peers revealed the unspoken laws of dominance, fear, and influence. He saw how jealousy could twist friendships, how envy could provoke betrayal, how even small lapses in composure could invite exploitation. And every time, he retreated inward, refining his mask, adjusting his tone, sharpening his instinct. What others revealed in haste or passion, he cataloged and stored. What others sought to conceal, he learned to detect. In this quiet accumulation of knowledge, he began to feel an unusual sense of power, the kind that needed no announcement, no applause, only awareness and timing. Why now? The boy had become a young man attuned to the undercurrents of every room he entered. He understood that his silence was a weapon, his observation a shield, his restraint a form of influence. Those around him remained largely unaware, perceiving him as quiet, perhaps detached, certainly peculiar. But within, he held a growing comprehension of cause and effect, of action and consequence, of how even the smallest gesture could ripple outward in ways the unobservant would never anticipate. This understanding would later form the foundation of a life spent shaping events and perceptions, moving unseen and commanding without force. And so the days passed, each one an exercise in patience, perception, and control. Shadows lengthened in the afternoons. The chill of evening settled over the town, and the world continued its slow rhythm, oblivious to the quiet preparation unfolding in its midst. He felt a sense of inevitability, as if each observation, each restraint, each disciplined moment was leading him toward a destiny both vast and intimate. The knowledge that the world did not reward honesty, that it valued mastery, that it measured power in subtle, almost invisible ways, was now embedded in him like a pulse, steady, relentless, and unyielding. Soft whisper transition. And so, as the night crept across rooftops and lanterns flickered in windows, his journey of quiet mastery moved forward, each moment of restraint building toward the shadowed path that would one day define the course of nations. Evenings were never simply the end of the day. They were a canvas for reflection. He would walk the silent streets, listening to the distant clatter of life, as if it were a symphony composed of secrets and desires. Every conversation he had witnessed, every gesture he had cataloged, played in his mind like a slow, deliberate rhythm. He noticed the subtle betrayals of posture, the micro-expressions that betrayed thought before words could articulate it. And in those small, unnoticed details, he found a kind of poetry, a silent narrative that spoke of human nature with a clarity that books and teachers never could. In these quiet hours, he began to understand the duality of power, its light and its shadow, its visible and invisible forms. He recognized that authority was not always exercised with a raised voice or a sharp command. Often, it flowed from patience, observation, and the careful withholding of information. The world responded to perception, and perception could be shaped without a single gesture, without a word. To move unseen was not weakness, it was strategy. To remain unread was not isolation, it was control. And slowly, imperceptibly, he internalized this rhythm, letting it guide every interaction, every thought, every heartbeat. School halls became arenas of subtle power plays. He observed the way whispers traveled faster than shouts, how laughter could mask contempt, how friendship could conceal envy. Teachers, unaware of his keen perception, revealed more about their expectations than they realized. Peers, in their need for validation, betrayed themselves in small ways that he noted and stored. Every flicker of emotion was a clue, every hesitation a signal. And yet, he revealed nothing. His own emotions, even when stirred, were folded inward, transformed into discipline. This self-control became a silent force, shaping the way he was treated and how others moved around him. Family life, too, became a careful study. Conversations over meals, the shifting expressions of relatives, the unspoken rules of interaction, all of it was observed with the precision of a historian studying the rise and fall of kingdoms. He learned early that attachment could be a vulnerability, that warmth could be exploited, that even affection carried risk when wielded without restraint. And so he measured every word, every glance, every tone of voice. He was not cold. He was careful. He was not unfeeling. He was strategic. And in this quiet self-mastery, he discovered a growing power that the world had yet to recognize. Books and history became guides in his silent education. He studied leaders who had risen and fallen, noting how restraint and perception often determine the outcomes more than courage or force. He read of generals who lost battles not because of strength, but because of misjudged emotion, of statesmen undone by the visible tremor of fear in their speech, of emperors betrayed by trust placed in the unworthy. And in every story, he found a mirror for his own developing understanding. That power was not in the display of strength, but in the quiet orchestration of circumstance, in the unseen movements that shaped outcomes. Music, too, became a companion. The slow unfolding of symphonies, the delicate layering of sound and silence, mirrored the rhythms he was learning in life. Crescendos were moments of action, pauses were moments of calculation, and harmonies were the subtle alignments of influence. He began to internalize these rhythms, letting them dictate his responses, his silences, and his strategies. Life, he realized, was a composition, and he was learning to conduct it without drawing attention to the baton in his hand. Occasionally, he felt the stirrings of emotion, anger at injustice, frustration at incompetence, fear at uncertainty, but each surge was met with a deliberate pause. He learned to let these emotions exist without dictating action, to observe them without surrendering to them, to convert them into insight rather than impulse. It was exhausting, quiet work, but it forged a resilience and clarity that those around him could not comprehend. The more he mastered this internal discipline, the more the world began to respond to him in ways subtle yet undeniable. He began to notice the power of presence, the way one could influence without speaking, guide without commanding, shape perception without declaration. Even among adults, the subtly controlled individual elicited respect, caution, and attention. And he saw how easily those untrained in restraint fell prey to manipulation, how quickly visible emotion could become a weapon in the hands of the observant. Each small victory of self-control was a lesson, each successful navigation of human interaction a confirmation of the path he had chosen. And as night deepened and the world outside dimmed into shadows, he felt a sense of inevitability. The lessons he had gathered, the skills he had honed, and the discipline he had enforced within himself were not mere survival tactics. They were the foundation of influence, of mastery, of a presence that could bend circumstance without overt force. He understood now that concealment was not cowardice, that restraint was not weakness, that true power often whispered rather than shouted. Soft whisper transition. And so, under the hush of the moon and the distant hum of life, his understanding solidified like a quiet river carving its course through stone, each moment of discipline shaping a mind destined to move the world without revealing the strength beneath. The quiet discipline he had cultivated now became a lens through which he understood the world. Faces, gestures, murmurs, all of it spoke a language that most overlooked. He saw desire in the flicker of an eye, fear in a tightening of the jaw, doubt in the brief hesitation before words escaped. And while others reacted to what was visible, he responded to what was invisible. The currents beneath, the intentions unspoken, the unguarded moments no one else noticed. It was in this silence that he found his advantage, a mastery of perception that others called intuition, but he recognized as patience shaped into power. Even in the smallest interactions, he exercised this control. A conversation with a teacher, a nod in a hallway, a smile that masked a thought, all became deliberate acts. He learned that restraint could command more than outspokenness, that silence could intimidate more than argument, that invisibility often carried authority that visibility could not. The world, he realized, was a web of expectation and reaction. Those who revealed too much became entangled. Those who controlled their expression moved above it, untouchable, unpredictable, and quietly feared. As adolescence deepened, his self-imposed lessons intensified. He became aware that the human heart was a currency, that emotion could be spent, borrowed, or stolen. To display it freely was to give away power. And so, each day, he trained himself to feel fully but to reveal nothing. The heat of anger, the tremor of fear, the pulse of excitement, they all existed, vibrant and alive within him, yet confined, folded into the architecture of his mind where no one could reach. This was not emptiness. It was a conscious containment, a reservoir of energy waiting for the precise moment when it could be deployed with effect. History became more than a record of events. It was a guidebook. He studied leaders who had mastered themselves, and those undone by their own passions. He read of Julius Caesar, whose calm exterior concealed a mind constantly calculating advantage, and of Napoleon, whose momentary cracks in control had altered empires. He saw how fear, joy, desire, and anger could be used as weapons in the hands of the observant. And he understood that mastery was not about suppressing humanity, but about knowing when to expose it and when to conceal it entirely. Even friendships became exercises in observation. He learned to notice which gestures indicated trust, which words concealed ulterior motives, which silences betrayed impatience. And he mirrored this precision in himself. He laughed when it was safe, spoke when it served, and remained unread in moments where exposure would cost him influence. Slowly, the people around him responded differently, not with suspicion, but with a subtle deference, a recognition of something that they could not articulate. He was present, but he was untouchable. By night, he would sit alone in the quiet of his room, reflecting on the lessons of the day. Each interaction, each observation, became part of a growing mental map, a charting of human nature that extended far beyond his immediate circle. He traced the patterns of trust, manipulation, ambition, and desire. He imagined himself as a conductor, orchestrating the unseen dynamics of a room, a school, a city, a world. And in this quiet imagining, he felt the first stirrings of a truth that would guide him through life. Power was born in awareness, nurtured in restraint, and wielded in silence. And so he continued, day after day, observation after observation, learning the rhythm of restraint. He experienced the frustrations of being misunderstood, the subtle pains of suppressed emotion, the loneliness that comes from knowing more than one can reveal. Yet in this solitude, he found freedom. Freedom from the chaos of others' expectations, freedom from the compulsion to react, freedom from the vulnerability that ensnared the unwary. The mastery of concealment was not cruelty. It was a shield, a tool, and ultimately a key. Softly, he realized that the lessons he had absorbed were not mere survival strategies. They were the foundation of influence, the subtle currents that directed human behavior without a word, without a gesture. He understood that to move unseen, to be unread, to conceal desire and fear alike, was to attain a form of power that few could comprehend. And he felt, with quiet certainty, that the mastery he had begun to cultivate would shape his path in ways that were invisible yet inevitable. And so, as the night deepened and the moonlight spilled in muted silver across his desk, he folded his thoughts into silence. The world outside slumbered, unaware of the subtle forces that shaped their lives. And in this gentle stillness, he found the first taste of control, the calm in the eye of a storm that others did not yet know was coming. Here, in patience and quiet observation, the journey toward mastery had begun. Soft whisper transition. And so, with the first chapter of life's lessons etched into his mind, the boy who felt everything yet showed nothing stepped toward the path that would define him. A path of restraint, of understanding, and of influence unseen, yet absolute. The descent began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the slow folding of shadows across a room. At first, it was only small moments, a tremor in his voice, a flicker of impatience behind his eyes, a hesitation that no one else seemed to notice. Yet these tiny exposures, like cracks in glass, invited the world to look closer, and the world did. Always. It was a predator, patient and calculating, watching for the smallest sign of weakness to exploit, to manipulate, to turn into advantage. He began to notice how swiftly emotion spread, like smoke curling through the air. A whisper of doubt, unnoticed by some, could ripple through a classroom or a meeting, unsettling decisions, tilting the balance in ways invisible yet undeniable. Anger, when shown too openly, became a spark that ignited unseen fires. Fear, ever contagious, could cripple confidence before the moment was even recognized. And the realization came slowly. To display too much was to surrender control, and surrender was a luxury he could not afford. This understanding came with a price. The descent into silence was lonely. Few understood the discipline it required, the constant vigilance of one's own expression, the painstaking monitoring of every word, every glance, every heartbeat. To live fully within his own mind while revealing nothing to the world was exhausting, and yet he endured. Every restraint became a rehearsal, every suppression of emotion a lesson in mastery. And in the quiet of this discipline, he began to feel the first stirrings of power that was subtle, unseen, yet undeniably present. History became his mirror. He read of leaders undone not by the armies they commanded, but by the glimpses of doubt that crossed their faces. Napoleon, at the height of his strategy, had faltered in letters and private thoughts. Julius Caesar, the embodiment of composure, had concealed every hesitation behind a mask of confidence. The lesson was clear. Those who exposed their hearts freely invited ruin, and those who learned to feel everything yet reveal nothing could move unseen, untouched by chaos, and quietly shape the currents around them. Even within the familiar confines of home and school, he practiced this restraint. Conversations became exercises in precision. He learned to speak when it served, to listen without betraying reaction, to mirror others while maintaining his interior sovereignty. Each interaction taught him patience, observation, and the subtle power of invisibility. Those who showed themselves too freely were caught in the web of others' expectations. He learned to step outside that web entirely. By night, in the dim candlelight of his room, he reflected on the day. Each observation, each carefully measured gesture, became part of a growing map of human behavior. He noted the subtle shifts in posture, the unspoken cues of attention and deception, the hidden desires that flickered like shadows across faces. And in these reflections, he recognized the truth that would guide him henceforth. Control was not about overt dominance, but about restraint, concealment, and patience. To master the currents of human interaction, one must first master oneself. And so he continued. Each day added layers to his understanding of silence and observation. Each misstep in others revealed more about the world than any display of power ever could. He felt the heat of emotion, the pull of instinct, the desire to react, but each impulse was folded inward, examined, and contained. He became a shadow, moving through a world that did not notice his vigilance, yet could never predict him. The descent into silence was not merely self-protection. It was a refinement of instinct, a forging of patience, a sharpening of perception. He understood that the path he walked was narrow and demanding, and that few could endure it. Loneliness accompanied him, but it was a disciplined loneliness, one that separated the observant from the reckless, the controlled from the impulsive. And in that separation, he discovered a kind of power that the world could not touch. Softly, as night deepened, he realized that mastery of concealment was also a mastery of freedom. Each emotion held within was a choice, not a compulsion. Anger could be released or restrained. Fear could guide thought without betraying itself. Desire could exist without vulnerability. He learned that the unseen currents of human behavior could be directed without effort, simply by remaining unread, invisible, and patient. And so, as the candle flickered in shadows stretched long across the walls, he understood the first truth of the descent. Control was born in silence, nurtured in restraint, and strengthened by the solitude that allowed reflection, observation, and mastery to grow. The journey had moved beyond mere awareness. It had become the deliberate shaping of every thought, every gesture, every pulse into the quiet rhythm of influence. Whisper soft transition. And so, as the night deepened, his descent into silence became a careful dance with the world, a dance of patience, observation, and quiet mastery, where every heartbeat and every thought moved him closer to a power unseen, yet undeniable. The quiet mastery of concealment grew steadily, like roots spreading beneath the surface of the earth, unseen but firm and unyielding. Each day brought new lessons, new glimpses of how the world responded to weakness and strength. He watched the way people measured each other, how every hesitation or tremor was cataloged, remembered, and used. Even in ordinary interactions, power existed, subtle and insistent, always seeking an advantage. And he knew that to survive, to influence, to shape outcomes, he could never allow his own vulnerabilities to be counted. It was not cruelty that guided him, nor desire for dominance without purpose. It was understanding. He learned that emotion, when displayed without control, became a tool in someone else's hands. Anger could be used to provoke you, fear to manipulate you, doubt to undermine you. In every moment of exposure, every small slip of truth in expression became a window through which others could enter your world and take what you could not give them. The knowledge weighed heavily. It was not oppressive. It was clarifying, a guide for how to exist safely and powerfully in a world that cared little for honesty, and even less for the open-hearted. His practice of silence became ritualistic, deliberate, sacred. Even small gestures were controlled. The tilt of a head, the lift of an eyebrow, the pause between words, all became instruments in the composition of his presence. To move through life without revealing the interior landscape of his mind was a form of art, one requiring patience, awareness, and infinite subtlety. Each interaction was a canvas, each response a brushstroke. And the masterpiece was a self unexposed, a presence that was quietly commanding without ever raising its voice. History whispered to him through the lives of those who had come before. Julius Caesar's calm, unbroken composure before the Senate, the impenetrable serenity of Napoleon in the face of adversity, the quiet determination of leaders who endured wars, betrayals, and revolutions, all spoke to the same truth. Control was earned in silence. Influence was carved in the patience of restraint. And survival demanded a mastery of the self that few could achieve, and even fewer could sustain. He saw the effect immediately. People were drawn to him, yet uncertain. They listened but could not anticipate. They followed, yet could not manipulate. And in that hesitation, that subtle uncertainty, he discovered the invisible currency of power. It was not loud, it was not forceful, it was not recognized by those seeking spectacle. But it existed, and it moved quietly like a shadow over a room. Even in moments of solitude, he continued the practice. The quiet reflection of the evening, the stillness of candlelight on a wooden table, the muted rustle of papers in an otherwise silent room. These became his laboratory. Each thought, each feeling, each rising pulse was observed, examined, and stored without leakage. And slowly, the discipline became instinct. He no longer had to force restraint. It became as natural as breathing. The descent into silence had transformed into a constant, living awareness, and with it came a subtle strength that others could neither touch nor predict. He also began to understand the rare beauty in this solitude. The world often mistakes the disciplined concealment of emotion for coldness, detachment, or even cruelty. And in some ways, that misunderstanding worked to his advantage. People underestimated him, misread his intentions, and failed to see the quiet fires that burned beneath the surface. The solitude, the careful observation, the patient withholding of what he felt, all of it became armor, camouflage, and a source of influence far more potent than any outward display of power could offer. And yet, he did not hide from life. He felt deeply, but selectively revealed nothing. He smiled when it was necessary, but never allowed joy to betray desire. He spoke when it served, but never allowed words to betray fear. He acted with precision, guided by instinct and patience. And in that careful choreography of self-control, he began to shape the world around him without anyone noticing. Allies moved within the orbit of his presence. Enemies misjudged him, and the currents of human behavior bent, almost imperceptibly, to his influence. The nights were long, filled with reflection and the subtle hum of candlelight. Each day had taught him new lessons about the power of invisibility. And in the calm of darkness, he could feel the subtle rhythm of mastery forming within him. The understanding that concealment was not cowardice, but the first step to influence. That silence was not emptiness, but an unseen force. That restraint was not weakness, but the truest expression of control. And so, as he sat alone in the flickering magenta-hued glow of his quiet room, the truth settled gently around him. Mastery was not a destination, but a continuous practice, a daily choice to feel everything yet reveal nothing. It was a path that demanded patience, reflection, and a deep understanding of human nature. And it was a path few could endure, but those who did became invisible currents shaping the world in ways unseen, yet profoundly felt. Whisper soft transition. And so, as the shadows deepened and the candle flickered low, his descent into silence had begun to weave into mastery, a quiet power that moved through the world unnoticed, yet undeniable, like the softest wind reshaping the surface of a still lake. The mastery of concealment began to bloom fully, quiet and imperceptible, like roots extending beneath frozen soil, strong, unseen, and unyielding. Every glance he cast, every word he chose, every pause he allowed, became a subtle declaration of control. He no longer reacted to the world. He guided it, gently, imperceptibly, like a river shaping stone over centuries. Each moment of restraint, each carefully held emotion, became a note in a quiet symphony of influence, composed in the private chambers of his mind and performed in the presence of others without their knowing. He understood now that true power was not loud or ostentatious. It was a shadow that moved through rooms, a whisper that carried weight without sound. People responded to him, but they could not predict him. Allies admired or feared him, yet could not manipulate him. Enemies studied him, yet remained blind to his intentions. And in that subtle uncertainty, that hesitation in the hearts of others, he discovered the rarest form of control, the invisible sway that comes not from force, but from perception itself. Even small gestures were transformed into tools. A lifted eyebrow, a measured sigh, the calm pause before a response. Each carried meaning, but only he knew the weight it bore. The world, untrained in the art of concealment, could not read these cues. Every emotion he felt, anger, fear, desire, doubt, was contained and refined in a strategy, bent to serve purpose rather than impulse. The art was not in denying feeling, but in mastering its timing and its revelation. It was an intimate, sacred craft, one that demanded patience, discipline, and relentless observation of both self and others. The lessons of history came alive in these quiet moments. He recalled the calm composure of leaders in war, the serene presence of men who faced betrayal and chaos, yet remained untouched. Julius Caesar, Napoleon, Churchill, each had understood, in their way, that the moment one's interior world is visible, one loses more than reputation. One loses freedom. And in that understanding, he saw the pattern, the invisible law. Concealment is not merely safety, it is the first form of power. In daily life, mastery shaped him in subtle ways. Conversations became arenas where influence flowed invisibly. People shared, revealed, hesitated, all without knowing the careful calculus guiding his responses. He listened without reaction, spoke without revealing intention, and felt deeply without allowing the world to touch his internal rhythm. Others could sense something in him, an unspoken authority, a quiet gravity, but they could not name it. And that ambiguity became his shield and his weapon, moving him through life untouchable and unbroken. Even solitude became a teacher. Candlelight flickered on worn pages, on the polished surface of a desk, on the faint dust in a quiet room. Each night he reflected, measured, and rehearsed the restraint he would carry into the following day. The solitude was neither lonely nor empty. It was sacred, a laboratory for the soul. And in these hours of quiet observation, he discovered the subtle joys of discipline, The knowledge that one could feel everything and yet be unaffected by the chaos outside. The serenity of being the observer, the composer, the silent master of unseen currents. He began to perceive the world differently. Small displays of emotion in others became maps of vulnerability, guides to strategy, reminders of why concealment mattered. Fear spread quietly yet swiftly. Anger ignited without warning. Doubt seeded hesitation. He had witnessed the devastation of those unguarded moments. And with every memory, every lesson, he refined his own practice, feeling deeply yet revealing nothing. He became the unseen hand, moving the pieces of a living board game without ever being fully seen. And still, he did not withdraw from life. He experienced beauty, sorrow, joy, and grief fully, yet the world remained unaware of the depths within him. The mastery of concealment was not detachment. It was a heightened awareness, a transformation of vulnerability into influence. The emotions that might destroy others became, in his hands, instruments of strategy. Desire was harnessed, anger refined, fear observed. And the result was quiet but undeniable, a presence that moved through the world untouchable, unread, and deeply influential. The days and nights passed in this rhythm of quiet mastery. Each interaction, each observation, each carefully controlled impulse became a note in the growing symphony of his influence. He understood now that the journey was not toward dominance or recognition, but toward a quiet freedom. The freedom to move, to act, to think, and to feel without yielding any part of oneself to the manipulations of the world. And so, as the candle's light flickered low and the night deepened, he sat in silence, knowing that mastery was not an achievement, but a continuous practice. Each day demanded vigilance, reflection, and restraint. Each moment was a choice, to reveal or to conceal, to yield or to command. And in that choice lay the power to shape not only his own destiny, but the unseen currents of those around him. Whisper soft transition. And as the last embers of the candle glowed in the quiet room, he felt the final contours of his mastery take form. A presence unseen yet profound, a calm power that would move quietly, shaping the world without anyone noticing. The world outside moved with chaos and clamor, yet he remained an island of quiet awareness. Each footstep, each rustle of cloth, each subtle shift in the faces around him was observed, recorded, and measured. He noticed the slight narrowing of eyes when suspicion arose, the faint tension in a jaw when doubt surfaced, the micro pauses that revealed thoughts before words did. To the untrained eye, these were inconsequential moments. To him, they were the threads of influence, the silent language of power waiting to be read. He understood that mastery was never announced. It did not demand applause or recognition. It existed in the invisible sway one held over circumstances and people. Others felt it, sensed it, even feared it, but rarely understood its source. It was a quiet, patient authority, the kind that could move kingdoms without a word, shift allegiances without confrontation, and guide outcomes without notice. And in that subtle dominion, he found a strange kind of beauty, the poetry of control exercised not by force, but by awareness. Even the simplest interactions became exercises in subtle command. A greeting could convey warmth, suspicion, or curiosity, depending on what he chose to reveal. A glance could calm a room or unsettle a colleague. Every gesture, every intonation, every pause was a brushstroke in the living portrait of influence he painted daily. The mastery of concealment turned ordinary moments into instruments of strategy, shaping perceptions, guiding actions, and protecting the unseen reservoir of his power. He reflected often on history, on the quiet men who had changed the course of nations without ever appearing to move at all. Leaders like Churchill, who stood calm amid fire and chaos, or Napoleon, whose letters concealed fear yet revealed calculated ambition, offered lessons that whispered across time. They taught him that the true measure of strength was not in domination, but in restraint, not in exposure, but in the patient, almost invisible orchestration of reality. In solitude, he practiced the hardest exercises of mastery, observing his own emotions without surrendering them. Anger, frustration, doubt, and desire all rose like tides within, yet none escaped to the world. Each feeling was acknowledged, understood, and transformed into something useful, a sharpened instinct, a measured decision, a silent warning. This internal alchemy was invisible, yet it made him impervious to manipulation. The world could sway, tempt, provoke, and unsettle others, but he remained steady, a quiet lighthouse in the storm. He also discovered the paradox of empathy in concealment. To truly master emotion, he needed to feel deeply, yet never show. He could sense fear, desire, and weakness in others because he understood it in himself. This allowed him to guide situations subtly, to adjust strategies quietly, and to protect himself while steering outcomes. It was not cruelty, it was wisdom. And in that wisdom, the most profound freedom revealed itself. The freedom to act without the world seeing the full measure of one's soul. Time moved differently for him. Hours stretched and contracted according to observation, reflection, and the silent rhythm of restraint. Ordinary men measured life by words spoken and actions taken. He measured life by understanding, anticipation, and the silent currents beneath human behavior. Each day became a lesson, each night a meditation. And with every cycle, his awareness deepened, his control refined, and his mastery grew more absolute, yet more invisible. Even relationships transformed under this quiet influence. Conversations were no longer mere exchanges, but subtle negotiations of trust, perception, and intention. Friends and colleagues could not always read him, yet they felt his presence, responded to it, and unconsciously adjusted. Those who sought to manipulate were often disarmed before they realized the game had already been decided. Influence flowed around him like water, unseen, essential, and unstoppable. And yet, he remained human, aware that the deepest mastery was not in denying feelings, but in understanding and commanding them. Desire, fear, joy, anger, these were instruments, not obstacles. They were tools that, when held in careful containment, allowed him to navigate the unpredictability of the world with calm precision. In mastering the self, he discovered the ability to move through life untouched, unshaken, and profoundly influential. As the candlelight flickered and shadows danced across the room, he reflected on the long path that had brought him here. The journey from awakening through descent to mastery had been silent, lonely, and exacting. Each lesson, each mistake, each moment of hesitation had been a step toward understanding the delicate balance between visibility and concealment, vulnerability and control. And in that understanding, he discovered a power more enduring than force, more subtle than authority, and more freeing than any overt triumph. Whisper soft transition. And so, as the night deepened and the world outside lay in restless sleep, he remained awake in quiet contemplation, feeling deeply, guiding subtly, and holding the world in the unseen space between thought and action. In the quiet hours, when the world seemed suspended between night and dawn, he reflected on the subtle art of invisibility. Power, he realized, was not always the loud command, the grand gesture, or the visible conquest. True influence moved quietly, like shadows tracing the contours of a room, unseen but undeniably present. Those who sought control through display were often the first to fall, their hearts and intentions laid bare to those who were already watching, already waiting. He understood that the world did not reward transparency. It rewarded the careful, the patient, and the observant. He remembered the lessons of history as if they whispered from the pages of old, dimly lit manuscripts. Men like Caesar, Churchill, and Napoleon had mastered the invisible currents of human behavior, manipulating perception without overt confrontation. They concealed doubts, fears, and desires, revealing only what served their purpose. And in that concealment lay a quiet strength, one that commanded respect and inspired caution. He studied them not for mimicry, but to understand the rhythm of mastery, the cadence of control, and the silent weight of authority. Every day became a meditation on restraint. Anger rose like a flame within, desire like a tide, fear like a shadow stretching across the mind, but none escaped to the world. Each feeling was noted, acknowledged, and transformed into clarity, into foresight, into a measure of quiet power. The mastery of concealment was not denial, it was command. To feel deeply but remain unread was to live untouchable, to move through life like a river beneath ice, present, flowing, yet hidden. In the rooms where decisions were made, he observed the subtle exchanges of influence. A flicker in the eye, a tremor in the voice, a hesitation in posture. These were signals, invisible to most, but readable to those who had trained themselves to see. And he had trained himself, not in aggression or threat, but in awareness and patience. He learned that the smallest gesture could shift a strategy, alter an outcome, or disarm an adversary before a word was spoken. Mastery was a conversation conducted in silence, in the unspoken, in the spaces between action and reaction. Relationships, too, were transformed by this quiet mastery. He could listen without revealing, speak without betraying intent, and guide without imposing. Others felt his presence, subtle but compelling, like a gentle current beneath still waters. Allies trusted him not because of promises or speeches, but because they sensed the depth of his understanding and the steadiness of his control. Rivals hesitated, unsure how to predict him, unable to manipulate the currents that he alone had learned to navigate. Influence, he realized, was often invisible, yet its effects were undeniable. He also understood the paradox of empathy within concealment. To guide, to influence, and to survive, he needed to feel deeply. Fear, grief, and desire were not obstacles. They were instruments. To sense them in himself allowed him to perceive them in others. This awareness granted him an almost sacred clarity, a lens through which the patterns of human behavior became readable and predictable. He moved through life like a shadow, yet one cast with purpose, deliberate and precise, touching outcomes without ever announcing his hand. Even the smallest daily interactions became exercises in subtle command. A nod, a glance, a pause. They were no longer incidental. They were deliberate strokes on the canvas of human perception. And because they were deliberate yet quiet, they carried a weight far beyond their apparent simplicity. Mastery, he realized, was as much about what was left unsaid as what was expressed. The unseen, the controlled, the carefully concealed. These were the tools of influence that shaped outcomes without spectacle or fanfare. Night after night, he honed this discipline, cultivating the patience to observe, the restraint to wait, and the wisdom to act only when the moment demanded it. Each trial, each moment of temptation to reveal himself, became an opportunity to refine his craft. And as mastery grew, so too did the freedom it offered. A freedom from manipulation, from expectation, from the chaos that swallowed those who could not conceal their hearts. In the final quiet of this long chapter, he understood the ultimate truth. Concealment was not cowardice, nor was it cruelty. It was wisdom, a path to untouchable influence, and a sanctuary for the soul. To master emotion, to hold it in reserve, and to release it only when necessary was to wield a power greater than any visible force. And in that mastery, the world itself became malleable, yielding quietly to those who understood the delicate balance between visibility and restraint. And so, as the candle guttered low and the shadows stretched across the room like dark silk, he felt the culmination of his descent into mastery. The journey had been silent, arduous, and exacting. Yet in the stillness, in the quiet awareness of every heartbeat, every breath, and every thought, he had become something rare, a man fully alive, fully aware, and fully untouchable. And as the night deepened, he waited, not impatiently, but with the calm certainty of one who understood the weight and rhythm of power. Whisper soft transition. And so, with the night folding itself around the silent world, he rested not because the day was over, but because mastery had taught him that strength often lies in stillness, patience, and the quiet shaping of destiny. In the dim glow of candlelight, he pondered the quiet architecture of human interaction. Power, he realized, did not always announce itself with thunder or grand gestures. Often, it moved softly, like wind tracing the edges of a still pond, barely noticed, yet shifting everything beneath the surface. The most profound influence was invisible to those who chased spectacle. Those who understood it, however, could guide entire rooms, shape decisions, and alter destinies, all without raising their voice. It was a language of presence, of observation, and of restraint. He reflected on the moments when a subtle glance, a carefully timed pause, or the slightest shift in posture changed the course of events. In these small gestures lay lessons that many overlooked. Fear could ripple through a gathering without a single word. Anger could ignite conflict from the faintest provocation, and hesitation could signal weakness to the most attentive observer. He had seen men toppled by what they thought were invisible signs, their strength undermined by a flicker of doubt or a tremor in their voice. And he understood, with quiet certainty, that mastery required vigilance over every heartbeat, every thought, and every expression. This awareness extended beyond confrontation or strategy. In relationships, the same principles applied. Listening without reaction, speaking without revealing intent, observing without being noticed. These are not tricks, but disciplines of influence. Those who moved through the world with unchecked emotion often became prey to the currents they failed to perceive. But he, having practiced the art of measured concealment, could navigate unseen, untouchable, and deliberate in every action. Even the simplest conversation became a careful study of human behavior, a map of desire, fear, and ambition etched subtly across faces and gestures. History whispered its own lessons in the quiet hours. Caesar's calm in the Senate, Churchill's measured gaze amidst devastation, and Napoleon's private fears masked in letters, all demonstrated the silent strength of controlled presence. Their influence was amplified not by the force of emotion, but by its careful concealment. To be untouchable, he realized, was not to ignore feelings, but to know them, command them, and release them only when it served a greater purpose. Mastery was not denial. It was awareness transformed into strategy. Even ambition itself became a silent teacher. The desire for recognition, the craving for approval, the pull of anger and vengeance, all were tools to be understood and contained. He practiced translating emotion into observation, transforming impulses into insight, and converting personal response into subtle guidance of others' actions. The world, he saw, responded more to signals than to spoken truths. And those who learned to control the signals, to measure the pauses and the glances, could shape outcomes with a precision that seemed almost unnatural. He remembered the times he faltered, when emotion betrayed him despite his best intentions. A tremor of doubt, a momentary glare, an unguarded expression. These were lessons etched into memory, reminders that mastery was never complete. Every misstep offered insight into the vulnerabilities of human perception, into the quiet ways in which influence could be lost, stolen, or misdirected. And yet, each error also strengthened his understanding, sharpening the awareness that would allow him to move with even greater precision next time. In the hush of night, he saw that true power was rarely seen and almost never applauded. It existed in subtlety, the silent decisions, the unspoken observations, the calm that held a room together without a word. Those who sought to dominate with display often revealed more than they intended, while those who mastered concealment moved like shadows, guiding events without ever appearing to touch them. And in this quiet, imperceptible control lay freedom. The freedom from manipulation, from chaos, and from the expectations of others. As he leaned back into the stillness, he realized that influence was a living, breathing current flowing through the smallest actions and reactions. It required patience, observation, and a constant attunement to the subtle signals around him. Each gesture, glance, and pause carried weight. Each decision, however minor it seemed, could ripple outward in ways unnoticed by those untrained to see. And mastery, he understood, was the ability to move these currents, to shape them, and to remain unseen while doing so. He closed his eyes for a moment and imagined the world as a vast, intricate network of invisible threads. Every person, every interaction, every unspoken thought was a thread. Those who understood the weave could influence patterns without effort, altering outcomes with a whisper rather than a shout. He felt a quiet reverence for this knowledge, knowing that it was both a responsibility and a gift. To wield influence unseen required patience, insight, and discipline, qualities rarer than courage and more powerful than force. And so, as the candle flickered in shadows stretched across the walls, he felt a stillness settle over him, a calm understanding of the invisible forces at play. Mastery was not in the display of emotion, but in the containment of it. It was in the recognition of currents, the anticipation of responses, and the quiet shaping of outcomes. And as the night deepened, he prepared to navigate the subtle tides of influence once more, guided by awareness, patience, and a deliberate restraint that made him untouchable. Whisper soft transition. And so, with the world quietly shifting around him, he moved unseen, feeling everything yet revealing nothing, ready to shape the next moment without ever being noticed. The room was silent, save for the faint tick of a distant clock. In that quiet, he felt the weight of observation settle over him like a soft, invisible cloak. Influence, he knew, was never loud. It did not announce itself with gestures or proclamations. It was woven into the spaces between words, into the rhythm of a conversation, into the briefest pauses where intent and reaction intertwined. Those who saw it or sensed it often mistook it for luck, for coincidence. Few recognized the deliberate patience behind each measured choice. He reflected on the lessons history had quietly imparted. The generals who commanded legions without raising their voices, the statesmen who shaped nations with careful words, and the philosophers whose ideas rippled across centuries, all had mastered the unseen. Their strength lay not in the power they displayed, but in the power they concealed. Every hesitation, every subtle tremor of thought became a tool of calculation for those who understood it, and those who did not were carried along by forces they could not comprehend. Even in simple interactions, he saw the threads of influence stretch outward. A friend's fleeting hesitation, a colleague's involuntary glance, a stranger's subtle discomfort. These were all signposts. Every human being broadcasted more than they intended. Each unguarded moment was a reflection of desire, fear, or doubt. And every reflection could be read by one who had learned to see without being seen. He understood, with a calm intensity, that mastery required absolute attention, not only to others but to oneself. The smallest lapse could undo months of careful calculation. He thought about the personal cost of this discipline. It was a quiet burden, a constant vigilance that demanded restraint at every moment. Anger could never spill too freely, fear could never betray itself, and longing could never be revealed. Even joy, the purest of emotions, needed careful containment. To expose any of it was to hand a weapon to someone waiting to exploit it. And yet, he felt no bitterness in this restraint. There was a satisfaction in knowing that freedom came not from indulgence, but from control. The night carried him further into reflection. Mastery, he realized, was not coldness, though many mistook it for that. It was awareness, finely honed and gently applied. It was understanding the natural currents of human behavior, then navigating them with subtlety and precision. It was listening deeply, speaking minimally, and moving deliberately. And in that quiet motion, one became untouchable, not through fear alone, but through the calm assurance that comes from knowing the world and oneself intimately. He recalled moments when influence had worked like a hidden hand. A single word, softly spoken, could shift opinion. A patient silence could allow others to reveal intentions. A glance, carefully timed, could redirect a conversation without confrontation. In these small acts lay the power that shaped not only individual decisions, but the larger flow of events. And yet, no one outside the observer's awareness ever recognized the full extent of it. The currents remained invisible, the influence undetected, and the mastery entirely private. Even as he moved through rooms filled with people, he sensed the subtle dynamics of hierarchy, desire, and expectation. Each individual carried hopes, fears, and ambitions like fragile instruments. By understanding them, by responding with care, by withholding reaction when needed, he became a quiet force within the room. Those around him often assumed they acted freely, unaware of the gentle guidance that steered them. And it was in that imperceptibility, in that invisible orchestration, that true power resided. He understood that mastery was a lifelong practice. It demanded patience beyond measure, and the willingness to feel deeply while remaining silent. Emotional restraint was not a denial of experience, but a refinement of instinct. By observing without reacting, by calculating without cruelty, he could translate internal understanding into subtle guidance. And the world, moving as it always did, responded. It bent gently, imperceptibly, to those who knew the quiet laws of influence. And yet, he was mindful that such power carried responsibility. To wield influence without awareness of consequences was dangerous. To misread a signal, to misjudge a moment, could undo the careful work of years. But with patience, attention, and humility, mastery became a tool not of domination, but of navigation, a compass guiding through the unpredictable currents of human behavior. In this, he felt a sense of freedom unlike any other, the freedom to act without being acted upon, to guide without coercion, to move without being seen. The candle flickered once, sending shadows that danced softly across the walls. He allowed himself a brief pause, breathing in the quiet and letting the weight of understanding settle. Influence, mastery, and restraint. These were not taught in textbooks or lectures, but learned through observation, reflection, and deliberate practice. And now, in the hush of night, he felt their presence as a gentle certainty, a soft authority that needed no proclamation to be real. And so, as the world outside rested, and as the candle's light cast its violet haze, he prepared for the next moment, ready to act with precision, to guide without revealing, and to master the subtle currents of influence with quiet confidence. The path was long, but he walked it deliberately, aware of every step, every glance, and every ripple he left in the space around him. Whisper soft transition, and as the night deepened further, he moved through shadows and silences alike, feeling the currents of influence swirl around him, unseen but fully known. The night air pressed gently against the window pane, carrying a cool, distant stillness. In that quiet, he thought about the invisible threads that connected all human intentions, desires, and fears. Every interaction, no matter how brief, left traces, tiny impressions of thought and emotion that could be read by a careful observer. And he had become such an observer, attuned to the faintest tremor in voice, the subtlest change in posture, the quietest flicker of hesitation in the eyes. These were not mere gestures. They were revelations, secret maps to the hidden world of motives and potential outcomes. He considered how easily people gave away their power. A word spoken in haste, a fleeting look, a sigh too loud. Each was a gift handed to those who understood the game. Most never realized what they surrendered. And yet, in that surrender lay the lesson. True influence came not from outward displays, but from the restraint to feel fully and reveal nothing. The world did not reward transparency, as so many believed. It rewarded discipline, foresight, and the quiet command of oneself. Even in solitude, he practiced this discipline. Every thought, every pulse of emotion, he observed without judgment, letting it move through him and settle like water in a still pond. Anger came, as it always did, like a shadow stretching across the mind, and he let it pass without action. Fear rose, like a cold wind brushing his chest, and he simply acknowledged it. Desire shimmered faintly, a quiet ember in the mind, and he contained it. Every feeling was acknowledged, every impulse measured, and nothing escaped the careful boundaries he set for himself. History whispered examples of men who failed because they could not master themselves. Generals who let fear show in the eyes of their troops. Leaders whose longing or doubt leaked through in letters or speeches. These men, brilliant in many ways, fell because the currents of influence swept them aside. And yet, those who understood the subtle power of concealment endured. They moved unseen, their intentions hidden, their strength quiet but undeniable. Their impact was felt without announcement, their victories silent yet profound. He reflected on the paradox of mastery. To appear human, to feel deeply, yet to remain untouchable. This required a delicate balance. Most men believed strength came from outward demonstration, but he had learned that strength was invisible. It was the calm in the eye of the storm, the measured word spoken only when it mattered, the gaze that observed without revealing. Others rushed forward with emotion, believing in their power to sway. He moved deliberately, guided by the invisible currents that most could not perceive. The room seemed to pulse softly with the weight of this realization. Influence was like a river beneath the surface of the world. Some swam on top, splashing and shouting, unaware of the deeper currents that carried them toward danger. He moved beneath, silent, guided, aware of every eddy and undertow. And in this quiet navigation lay his advantage, a power that required no recognition, no applause, no acknowledgement. It simply existed, as natural and inevitable as the passage of time. Even in the presence of others, he maintained this equilibrium. He listened more than he spoke, allowing people to reveal themselves, to expose their intentions unwittingly. Every pause, every carefully chosen word, became a tool to guide outcomes without confrontation. Allies felt guided, enemies felt subtly contained, and the world around him bent imperceptibly to his awareness. It was a power few recognized, yet it shaped decisions, conversations, and events with quiet authority. He understood that this mastery was not about avoidance. It was not about retreating from emotion or human connection. Rather, it was about transforming instinct into influence, vulnerability into strategy, feeling into a deliberate choice. To master oneself was to understand both the storm and the stillness within, to act when necessary, and to remain invisible when restraint was required. And in this, he found a profound freedom. The freedom to act without being acted upon, to guide without revealing, to exist fully without surrendering control. The candle flickered, casting elongated shadows across the walls, as if the room itself breathed with the rhythm of his understanding. And in that soft light, he realized that the currents of influence were everywhere, subtle but powerful, shaping every human interaction, every decision, every whispered intention. Those who perceived them wielded power quietly. Those who ignored them were swept along. And he, having learned the art of quiet observation, moved with a deliberate grace that few could detect, but all were affected by. And so, as the night deepened, he sat in silence, feeling the invisible threads of human behavior flow around him, aware of their strength, their reach, and their subtle guidance. Each breath, each heartbeat, each flicker of thought was part of a larger rhythm, one he had learned to read and to navigate with calm precision. And in that stillness, mastery was no longer an abstract ideal. It was a lived, breathing presence, guiding him quietly, powerfully, and invisibly through the world. Whisper's soft transition, and as the candle dimmed further, he understood that mastery was not merely survival. It was the gentle, unshakable command of the currents that moved the lives of others without ever touching them. The evening grew quieter still, and the dim candlelight traced long, trembling lines across the worn wooden floor. In that soft illumination, he felt the weight of observation, the endless watching, the constant noting of subtle movements and fleeting expressions. Every person, every gesture was a story waiting to be understood, and he had become fluent in that silent language, reading the whispers of intent in the tilt of a head, the flicker of an eye, the almost imperceptible hesitation in a hand. In this fluency lay his edge, quiet but undeniable, shaping outcomes long before words could be spoken. He remembered the faces of men who had failed, undone by emotion. A general who revealed frustration too soon. A statesman whose anxiety leaked into his voice. A friend who betrayed hope too openly. These were lessons etched into the landscape of history. They were not weak men in their essence. They were merely untrained in the subtle art of concealment, unaware that every emotion they displayed could be used as a weapon. And in contrast, those who mastered themselves moved like shadows, influencing without confrontation, guiding without notice, surviving storms that swallowed others. In solitude, mastery became a ritual. He felt anger rise and acknowledged it, yet it remained unspoken, a private ember glowing without consuming. Fear came, like a cool breath, and he allowed it to exist without spilling into action. Desire shimmered, soft and persistent, but he contained it as one might hold water in cupped hands. Every feeling passed through him, every impulse recognized, every pulse counted, yet none were allowed to escape at the wrong moment. This was not suppression. It was awareness honed into discipline, a quiet command over the self that others mistook for calm or coldness. He thought of history again, of those who had wielded influence without revealing their hearts. Napoleon, with his private doubts recorded in letters never meant for the world. Yet once exposed, they reshaped perception. Caesar, outwardly flawless, yet masking inner tremors that could have betrayed him. Churchill, calm amidst chaos, giving confidence to millions simply by controlling what was seen. These men were powerful not because they had no fear, no anger, no longing, but because they transformed it into a quiet force, invisible yet utterly effective. Even when surrounded by people, he practiced restraint. He spoke sparingly, choosing each word like a brushstroke, letting silence do the work that emotion often spoiled. He listened with intent, allowing others to reveal their motives, their anxieties, their desires, without ever showing his own. Allies felt guided, enemies hesitated, and the world shifted subtly around him. Influence, he understood, was not loud or showy. It was felt, not proclaimed. It was the gentle gravity of presence, the imperceptible pull of unseen currents, the quiet certainty that shaped decisions without raising notice. In that dim room, with shadows curling like soft smoke along the walls, he realized mastery was also a form of freedom. Freedom from manipulation, freedom from the chaos that unbridled emotion created, freedom from being pulled along by forces outside himself. To master the self was to master circumstance. Every decision, every interaction, every glance became intentional, chosen, deliberate. And in that choice lay an immense, quiet power, a force that did not announce itself, but demanded acknowledgement simply by its existence. He reflected on the paradox again. Mastery required deep feeling, yet total concealment. To deny emotion entirely was not mastery. To reveal it recklessly was not strength. True command came from understanding, observing, and restraining. To feel everything and reveal nothing was the silent strategy, the hidden advantage, the unseen current that moved the world in subtle, inexorable ways. It was the art of being fully alive while remaining untouchable, aware without exposure, human without vulnerability to those who would exploit it. The candle's flame flickered against the textured walls, casting violet-hued shadows that danced softly like the currents of human thought he so carefully tracked. Every gesture in the room, every sound beyond the door, every flicker of consciousness was part of the web he navigated. He understood, more deeply than most, that the world responded not to truth or honesty, but to perception and control. And in that understanding lay his quiet supremacy, invisible yet absolute. And so, as the night deepened, he felt the subtle currents of influence move around him and through him, carrying knowledge, shaping actions, and guiding outcomes with silent authority. The mastery of concealment was no longer an abstract idea. It was a living, breathing presence. And in the stillness of the candlelit room, he knew that to move unseen, to guide without revealing, to survive storms without surrendering, was the true path to power. Whisper soft transition, and as the candle's last ember faded, he felt the calm certainty that mastery was not an act. It was a way of existing, quiet, deliberate, and untouchable, preparing him for the next currents yet to come. The night held its quiet vigil as he moved through thoughts like a shadow through a still room. Each lesson of concealment had layered itself into memory, each flicker of emotion cataloged, understood, and transformed into silent strategy. There was a rhythm to it, a cadence that required patience, awareness, and almost reverent restraint. Every heartbeat carried potential revelation, every breath a choice between exposure and preservation. And in that rhythm, he found a serenity that others often mistook for detachment. He recalled the subtle betrayals he had witnessed, the moments when men had unknowingly handed their vulnerabilities to those with sharper eyes and calmer hearts. A glance too long, a voice too trembling, a sigh too soft. All these became threads in the invisible web of influence that connected human intent. Those who could read these threads moved with advantage. Those who could not were easily pulled by currents they could never see. And in this truth, he found the necessity of mastery, to feel fully, yet reveal nothing until it served the purpose of quiet command. Even in solitude, mastery required presence. He felt the pulse of fear within himself, a distant echo that had no claim over action. Anger flared, bright and quick, yet he allowed it to dissipate in the stillness, contained as one might hold smoke in cupped hands. Desire shimmered like distant starlight, and he acknowledged it, yet did not reach out to grasp it, to experience life in its fullness and yet remain untouchable. This was not denial. It was a deliberate refinement of instinct. Each emotion became a tool, each impulse a measured step along a path that few understood. History whispered its lessons through him. Napoleon, cautious in letters, aware of every impression he left. Caesar, flawless in appearance, unreadable even to his closest allies. Churchill, steady amid catastrophe, giving confidence with controlled presence. These men had mastered the delicate dance between humanity and concealment. They were not unfeeling, they were precise. Their influence was not shouted but felt, radiating quietly, subtly, shaping outcomes without spectacle. And he recognized the same pattern in his own life. Mastery was the invisible hand that guided, protected, and preserved. Interactions became a landscape of observation. Every meeting, every conversation, every subtle gesture was an opportunity to learn, to anticipate, to act without exposing the self. Allies revealed intentions unbidden. Enemies betrayed strategy without knowing. And in this delicate balance, he moved like a current beneath the surface of a calm lake, felt only by those who tried to disturb it, yet untouched, steady, unbroken. The world responded not to what was true, but to what was projected, and the mastery of concealment became both shield and weapon. Even in personal connections, mastery shaped reality. He listened without reaction, spoke without revealing intent, and allowed others to believe they guided him while he remained fully aware. Strength lay not in dominance, but in containment. Respect was earned not by force, but by the subtle gravity of presence. Hesitation in others, admiration, and even fear were born of perception, guided by invisible currents that he alone commanded. In every space he occupied, the careful balance of feeling and restraint created an authority that was at once private and undeniable. And still, he felt the weight of his emotions. They existed fully within him. Anger, grief, longing, fear, but they did not dictate his actions. He had learned the quiet discipline of recognition without release, of understanding without exposure. Mastery was not the absence of life. It was the refinement of it. To feel everything and reveal nothing was the silent art that separated survival from surrender, influence from submission, power from vulnerability. The candle flickered once more, sending violet-tinted shadows across the room. He watched the movement, sensing in it the impermanence of all things, the subtle shifts that mirrored human behavior. Just as light bent and stretched across the walls, human currents could be guided, understood, and navigated without confrontation. And he, standing quietly in that gentle illumination, was both observer and participant, invisible yet present, untouched yet profoundly influential. And so, as the night deepened, he understood that mastery was not a destination, but a continuous path. Each day, each interaction, each silent observation honed the self, shaped perception, and strengthened control. To move through the world unseen, yet felt in subtle ways, was the ultimate freedom. And in this freedom, he found peace, the steady calm of knowing that to feel without exposing, to observe without reacting, was the quietest and most profound form of power. Whisper soft transition, and as the final embers of candlelight waned, he realized that this mastery was not an achievement, but a living rhythm, a pulse that would guide him silently through the currents yet to come, as the world continued unaware of the quiet influence he wielded. The world, he realized, was built not only of actions, but of invisible scaffolding, threads that held moments, choices, and lives in subtle alignment. These threads were not obvious, and they often went unnoticed by those who rushed through the day. But for him, they were as tangible as the soft candlelight that kissed the walls, delicate yet unyielding. To see them was to understand the unseen architecture of influence, the quiet forces that shaped outcomes long before any hand intervened. Power, he learned, was not in grand gestures. It did not roar through speech or flash in opulent display. Instead, it hid in patience, in the weight of silence, in a single measured glance that spoke volumes without sound. A room of chatter and movement could bend around his presence without a word being spoken. Allies aligned themselves, rivals recalibrated, and even the indifferent seemed to pause and notice, sensing the subtle gravity he projected. And yet, to the untrained eye, nothing remarkable occurred. The mastery of perception was invisible, yet absolute. He remembered those who had failed, men who believed that influence was earned through visibility and expression. Their emotions, unguarded and raw, were gifts offered to others, and the world accepted them eagerly, shaping its response around these exposed vulnerabilities. Anger invited challenge, fear invited attack, and desire invited manipulation. Even loyalty could turn when it was guided by the cues of the unrestrained. To survive, to shape reality, one had to learn the quiet architecture beneath the noise, the hidden currents that no one else saw. In practice, this meant observing more than acting, listening more than speaking. He understood that every human interaction contained layers, each gesture a potential revelation. The tilt of a head, the way a hand lingered on a table, the fleeting micro-expression that crossed a face. These were the markers of intention, the unspoken signals that shaped every decision around him. And within that understanding lay a profound responsibility. To know was not to dominate. It was to navigate with care, to respond with precision, to act only when the moment demanded. History, as he studied it in quiet reflection, offered lessons carved from the triumphs and failures of others. Leaders who understood the invisible, who measured every movement and considered every signal, were those who endured, while the impulsive, the emotional, the transparent were swept aside. Julius Caesar, who masked uncertainty. Catherine de' Medici, who whispered through the court without revealing her hand. Churchill, whose calm presence held the weight of nations in wartime. All had mastered this hidden architecture. Their power was not flamboyant. It was structural, quiet, inevitable. And yet, the mastery of this architecture demanded solitude and patience. One had to endure the loneliness that came with observation, the subtle isolation that arose from knowing too much while revealing too little. Others would misinterpret quiet for weakness, reflection for passivity, and restraint for indifference. These misperceptions were not a flaw. They were the natural consequence of hidden control, a mark that he was moving in currents that others could not see. Even daily life became an exercise in structural awareness. Meetings, conversations, and casual encounters were not trivial. They were the architecture in motion, threads being pulled, tensions measured, influence exerted invisibly. He learned to time his words with the rhythm of the room, to let actions precede notice, to observe before participating. In this, the ordinary became extraordinary. Life itself was a system of subtle forces, and mastery was the ability to move within it without disturbance, yet with decisive impact. There was also a quiet poetry to the practice. Each interaction was like a stanza, each pause a verse, each gesture a line in a larger composition that only he could see. The art was not in exhibition, but in orchestration, the deliberate shaping of outcomes without fanfare, the quiet guidance of events so that they unfolded exactly as intended. It was a dance, slow and deliberate, where every step mattered and every misstep could ripple beyond repair. He had learned that patience was more than a virtue. It was a tool, a lever that moved circumstances with quiet authority. To act too soon was to fracture the invisible threads. To wait, to observe, to let the currents settle, was to bend reality to his will without resistance. In this, he found both discipline and liberation, for the world could rush, rage, and stumble around him, but he remained anchored, deliberate, untouchable. The soft weight of control rested in his chest like a steady heartbeat, quiet but unwavering. The mastery of concealment, he realized, was inseparable from understanding desire, his own and that of others. Every longing, every frustration, every flicker of impatience carried meaning. And yet, the true power was in experiencing those feelings fully and letting no one else glimpse them. To the untrained eye, he appeared composed, perhaps even cold. But within, he moved through the storm of emotion like a silent river, flowing with its currents, never letting it spill onto the surface. He recalled moments when he had watched others crumble under their own exposure. Men who spoke too freely, who let anger or fear escape in a word or gesture, had given the world the measure of their limits. They had provided the blueprint for manipulation, the map to their vulnerabilities. And yet, those same men often believed they were transparent and honest, noble in their openness. They had not understood that the world did not reward honesty. It rewarded mastery. In the quiet of his own reflection, he traced these lessons through history, through the lives of those who had walked the delicate bridge between vulnerability and control. Leaders, strategists, and tacticians who had learned to feel without revealing, to act without exposing, had survived storms that would have swallowed the unguarded whole. Their strength was invisible, their influence silent, yet its impact was absolute. To observe them was to witness poetry in motion, a careful weaving of circumstance, intention, and perception into an unbreakable lattice. Even mundane interactions became exercises in subtle mastery. A pause before speaking, a measured tone, the way one met another's gaze. All were threads that shaped outcomes without drama or spectacle. Allies, unaware of his calculations, aligned themselves instinctively. Rivals, sensing only the weight of presence, misjudged their own position. And he, moving quietly through these currents, became the unseen hand that directed the flow of events. The world, bustling and chaotic, bent gently around the rhythm he imposed, never knowing that it had been guided at all. There was a rhythm to this work, a slow cadence that mirrored the night itself. Moments of tension, like sharp breaths of wind, passed and settled, leaving calm and clarity in their wake. And in this clarity, he discovered the beauty of restraint, the quiet artistry of holding power without display, of shaping reality with a soft touch rather than a hammer. The mastery of influence was not loud. It was measured, intimate, profoundly patient. Yet, he understood that this path was lonely. Few could grasp the quiet architecture of power, and fewer still could walk it without faltering. The human mind, craving validation and recognition, balked at invisibility. But invisibility was not weakness, it was sovereignty. To control perception, to guide outcomes without revealing intent, was the pinnacle of authority. And with this understanding came a deep, almost sacred responsibility to wield power without spectacle and to act with precision at every moment. He remembered the lessons carved into history by those who had done this before him. Churchill, composed amidst destruction, lent confidence to millions without revealing despair. Catherine de' Medici moved courts like shadows, influencing outcomes without ever stepping fully into the light. Julius Caesar projected calm, while uncertainty brewed beneath. Each had understood that mastery was less about domination and more about knowing when to reveal and when to remain concealed. Their legacy was not in the noise they made, but in the currents they shaped quietly, invisibly, enduringly. And so, as he reflected in the dim candlelight, the room itself seemed to echo the quiet truth he had discovered. Shadows danced softly on the walls, carrying the memory of restraint. The air was thick with the sense of possibility, of hidden currents waiting to be understood and guided. Every decision, every glance, every unspoken word had the power to alter the trajectory of events. Mastery was not the loud triumph of action. It was the subtle, continuous shaping of the world in silence. Whisper soft transition, and as the night deepened further, he sensed the threads stretching endlessly ahead, unseen by others yet alive beneath his fingertips, and he knew that the full measure of power would only reveal itself when every emotion had been felt, and none had been given away. The night carried a stillness that felt almost sacred, as if the world itself paused to observe the subtle workings of restraint. He understood that power was rarely seized in dramatic gestures. It was cultivated in the quiet, invisible moments when no one else was watching. A pause, a deliberate step, the soft curvature of a glance. All became instruments as precise as a musician's fingers on strings. Each action measured, each silence intentional. He moved not to dominate, but to orchestrate, to bend circumstances with the gentlest touch. It was in these quiet practices that he found clarity. Anger simmered without scorching the moment. Fear sharpened instinct without spilling into perception. Doubt whispered, and he listened, but it never guided him publicly. Desire rose and fell like the tide, acknowledged privately but held securely. To master oneself was to acknowledge every inner tremor and yet present a surface that revealed nothing. In doing so, he became a paradox, a man fully alive within, yet unreadable to the world around him. He reflected on those who had failed before him, men of brilliance undone by the unguarded display of a fleeting sentiment. A frown, a quiver, a wavering voice, small, almost imperceptible, yet enough for others to map the landscape of vulnerability. The world, he realized, did not reward honesty. It rewarded the ability to feel deeply and conceal completely. To reveal was to surrender. To surrender was to give others the power to manipulate. And in that manipulation, the unprepared lost not only advantage but themselves. History itself seemed to study in these quiet dynamics. Leaders who moved through conflict with measured presence shaped empires more enduringly than those who relied on force alone. Napoleon's letters, once private, became instruments for others to judge him, illustrating the peril of uncontrolled emotion. Caesar, serene before the Senate, commanded respect because no tremor betrayed doubt. And Churchill, amidst the roaring destruction of a world at war, held his people with calm certainty, letting no despair slip through the mask of leadership. Each had understood the same principle. Concealment was not deceit, it was sovereignty. Even in everyday moments, the practice of mastery revealed itself. He observed the interplay of gestures, the subtle shifts in attention, the micro-expressions that went unnoticed by most but spoke volumes to those who watched carefully. A nod, a pause, a carefully measured silence. Each acted like a lever, influencing outcomes without declaration. Influence, he realized, was far more potent when unannounced. Those who sought spectacle often squandered power. Those who cultivated subtlety, precision, and restraint held it like a quiet flame, steady and enduring. The mind, once untrained, could falter under such demands. To observe without reacting, to feel without revealing, required constant vigilance. Every heartbeat, every breath, every shifting thought became data, a living map of circumstances and human behavior. The price was solitude, loneliness woven into the fabric of discipline. Few could follow this path without fatigue or frustration. Yet those who persevered discovered an almost hypnotic rhythm. In this rhythm, mastery was less an act and more a state of being, a quiet sovereignty that moved like water through unseen channels. He considered the subtle art of influence in personal relations. Words spoken too soon, truths revealed too freely, left one exposed to subtle currents of manipulation. Those who could listen without reacting, respond without revealing intention, and act with invisible precision commanded respect without ever raising a voice. The strongest presence, he noted, was the one that did not seek attention. People felt its weight instinctively. They deferred, adjusted, or feared it without needing explanation. Mastery, in its highest form, required no display. Its power existed in its invisibility. And so, as the candle flickered gently beside him, casting violet shadows along the walls, he felt the culmination of lessons absorbed from history, observation, and quiet reflection. Mastery was not a sudden revelation, but a continuous practice. It required living each moment fully while revealing nothing. It demanded patience, discipline, and profound self-awareness. In this practice, he saw a kind of sacred freedom. Freedom from manipulation, from chaos, from emotional chains that bound ordinary men. He understood, finally, that true power was not in being seen, but in moving unseen, untouchable, shaping outcomes while the world remained unaware of the hand guiding them. Whisper soft transition, and as the night stretched further, the understanding settled like a quiet pulse. That every emotion could be felt, every vulnerability acknowledged, yet nothing given away. And in this delicate balance, he discovered the final doorway to mastery, waiting just beyond the edge of consciousness. In the dim glow of candlelight, he traced the patterns of human behavior like a scholar tracing constellations. Each movement, each whispered word, each glance carried weight, though most were blind to it. Power, he realized, was woven into these invisible threads, and mastery was the art of navigating them without disturbing their balance. To act without revealing, to observe without reacting, to feel without showing. That was the quiet, sacred architecture of influence. He thought of the countless moments when men had failed themselves. A flash of pride, a sigh of frustration, a tremor of doubt. These seemingly trivial gestures became maps for those attuned to them. People were not malicious by default, but they were strategic. They saw opportunity in vulnerability, advantage in uncertainty. And in the subtle revealing of the self, the unguarded man handed them the keys to his world. He had witnessed it countless times in boardrooms, battlefields, and courts of judgment. Each slip of composure, each flicker of uncontrolled emotion shifted the balance of power ever so slightly, and sometimes irrevocably. Yet, there was a quiet poetry in restraint. The ability to feel everything and give nothing away transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary. Anger could be acknowledged internally, sharpened into focus, yet presented externally as calm. Fear could teach lessons, guide decisions, and awaken instinct, but never betray the heart. Desire could exist as a private flame, warming thought and strategy, yet never visible to those who might exploit it. Mastery was not the absence of feeling. It was the choice of when and how to reveal it. And yet, mastery was not coldness. It was discipline refined into instinct, awareness refined into subtlety. It was the ability to transform vulnerability into strategic strength, to allow emotion to guide without ever betraying it. In this refinement, he found a kind of sacred rhythm. Moments of tension became gentle lessons. Moments of fear became measured insight. Every heartbeat, every sigh, every glance was part of an intricate dance, choreographed to balance power and presence. Those who failed to respect this rhythm fell prey to the currents around them, swept away by the very emotions they could not conceal. He felt a deep, whispering stillness settle around him, as if the world itself had softened to observe this quiet mastery. The candlelight flickered, painting shadows that hinted at both the vastness and intimacy of the human mind. To move unseen, unread, and untouchable was to walk a sacred path, a path that demanded patience, attention, and reverence for the invisible forces that shaped reality. Mastery was not declared. It was lived. It was breathed. It was the subtle pulse beneath the visible, the quiet heartbeat that guided, protected, and transformed. And so, as the night deepened, he understood a truth that history had whispered to those who could hear. Concealment was not merely a shield. It was a living instrument of influence. Those who mastered themselves, who held their emotions like carefully tended flames, moved through the world with a power that was both unseen and undeniable. To reveal too much was to surrender. To conceal, to observe, and to act with deliberate precision was to command. In the stillness of that realization, the final lesson settled quietly, as if spoken by the candlelight itself. Mastery is freedom, and freedom is the calm, invisible power that shapes the currents of destiny. Whisper soft transition, and as the first light of dawn began to touch the edges of the room, he realized that every secret, every silent observation, and every carefully measured choice had led him to a threshold, where understanding met action, and where the unseen hand could finally guide the world. The night had deepened into a velvet quiet, the kind that seemed to stretch time itself. In this stillness, he reflected on the subtle threads that bound human lives together, threads woven of observation, patience, and restraint. Power, he realized, was not something shouted or wielded violently. It moved in whispers, in the spaces between words, in the gentle arch of a brow, in the pause before a reply. It was invisible, yet undeniable, shaping the currents of human thought and action with a precision that few could perceive. He thought of the men who had failed to grasp this truth, whose emotions had betrayed them like open windows to the world. Fear had leaked through hesitant steps, anger through sharp tones, and desire through the softest flicker of longing in the eyes. Those who observed, who measured every subtle gesture, had taken these offerings and turned them into advantage. The world did not reward sincerity, he reminded himself. It rewarded control, foresight, and the mastery of self. And mastery, in its quietest form, was the ultimate form of power. Even in moments of profound turmoil, he had learned to hold himself. The pulse of anxiety could guide thought without betraying intention. The heat of anger could fuel strategy without revealing the heart. Desire, longing, grief, they were all acknowledged internally, but externally, nothing was given. The art of concealment was not cruelty, it was sacred discipline. Each restraint, each measured action, was a declaration of unseen authority, a signal that no one, not friend nor foe, could easily sway him. In that discipline lay freedom. The freedom to move through the world untouchable, immune to manipulation, and quietly unstoppable. He recalled historical figures, men whose composure had become their signature. Winston Churchill, standing amidst the ruins of London, unshaken as fire consumed the streets, understood this instinctively. His calm inspired courage in others, concealed fear from enemies, and shaped events more profoundly than any overt act of force. Napoleon, too, had felt the weight of internal turmoil, writing private letters that revealed insecurity only to be exploited when they fell into the wrong hands. The lesson was clear. Vulnerability was never a gift. It was currency to be spent wisely, if at all. And a master, he realized, never spent it recklessly. In personal life, the stakes were no less profound. Relationships, alliances, even casual interactions carried potential for exposure and exploitation. To speak, to gesture, to reveal emotion. All were opportunities for others to measure, judge, and manipulate. Mastery demanded the transformation of instinct into strategy, of feeling into silent guidance. One listened without yielding. One responded without giving away intention. One acted with complete awareness of the unseen forces at play. Every heartbeat, every breath, every glance became part of a careful choreography, a dance of influence that shaped outcomes before they were even visible. Yet mastery was not devoid of life or warmth. The heart still felt joy, grief, and wonder. It still responded to beauty, to laughter, to connection. But these responses were held like treasured instruments, played only when the moment demanded, never revealing the full repertoire to those who might misuse it. There was poetry in restraint, an elegance in choosing when and how to reveal the self. The world, he understood, was always watching for cracks in the mask. Those who left themselves exposed were swept aside by currents they could neither see nor control. Those who mastered concealment moved as shadows through storms, guiding destiny while appearing untouched. As dawn began to trace the edges of the night, he sensed the quiet power that comes from understanding, patience, and deliberate action. Influence was not loud or spectacular. It was the invisible hand that guided without effort, the silent voice that shaped without command, the calm force that inspired obedience without notice. Mastery was the ability to bend circumstance and perception to one's will, not through spectacle or threat, but through the art of self-possession. Those who mastered themselves became untouchable, living above the fray, unseen yet profoundly present. And so, as the candlelight faded and the first soft glow of morning touched the room, he reflected on the ultimate truth. Concealment was not cowardice, nor was it detachment from life. It was discipline, insight, and sacred freedom. Every measured glance, every silent calculation, every restrained emotion was a step toward an unseen power that could shape worlds. To reveal too much was to surrender. To feel everything and show nothing was to command. And in that command, the currents of human action bent quietly, invisibly, to the will of the master. Whisper soft transition. And as the day began anew, the lessons of restraint and observation settled like a gentle tide, carrying him toward the final chapter of his journey, where knowledge, patience, and mastery would converge, and the unseen currents of influence would become fully visible in their quiet, unstoppable force. The world had not changed. Cities still hummed with the faint pulse of ambition. Rooms were still filled with whispered calculations, and the air was thick with the subtle tremors of desire and fear. But he moved through it differently now. Every step was deliberate, every word measured, every glance a quiet claim of authority. The lessons of concealment, patience, and discipline had crystallized into something almost sacred: mastery. And mastery was a throne that no one could see, yet everyone felt its weight. He remembered the long descent into understanding, the slow unraveling of every impulse, every emotion, until he could feel them all without letting them show. Anger, grief, fear, longing. There were no longer wildfires threatening to scorch him. They were instruments, humming quietly beneath his skin, ready to be played with precision. He had learned to recognize their rhythms, to anticipate their movements, to bend their force toward purpose. In this internal calm, the chaos of the world became a mirror, reflecting opportunities instead of threats, revealing currents instead of obstacles. There was power in silence. It was the kind of power that did not shout, did not demand, did not reveal itself. It moved in shadows, in the spaces between conversations, in the subtle rise and fall of attention. He watched as others rushed to act, to speak, to declare themselves, unaware that their own exposure was giving him control. Every hesitation in their eyes, every tremor in their voices, every flicker of doubt became his map. The master reads these currents not to dominate through force, but to guide through understanding. He intervenes only when the moment demands it, and when he does, his actions are decisive, inevitable, and quietly devastating. History had offered examples, whispers from the past that shaped his understanding. Churchill had stood amidst ruin, bombs falling around him, and yet his calm presence had steadied millions. Napoleon had faltered in private, revealing the cracks that enemies would exploit, and the lesson had been etched in the annals of strategy. Vulnerability is never a gift. It is the currency of the unwise. He had observed, studied, and internalized these lessons until they became instinct, until his own heart no longer betrayed him. Every interaction now was a carefully composed scene. In the market, he observed merchants weighing each other's words. In councils, he watched allies hesitate, rivals advance, and he waited. Always he waited. The impulse to speak, to act, to reveal even a fraction of thought was suppressed beneath layers of awareness. Each suppression was a claim, each observation a silent command. The world responded not to what he said, but to what he withheld. It moved around him as if gravity itself had shifted. In personal life, mastery became even more delicate. Love, friendship, loyalty, they were intricate dances demanding the same discipline he had applied to power. He listened without giving away desire, smiled without exposing longing, acted without betraying preference. Those closest to him began to sense it, this quiet magnetism that drew respect, hesitation, even admiration. But they could not name it. It was invisible, yet irresistible. Influence does not require consent when it is subtle. It flows through the choices of others, unnoticed, until the shape of the world conforms quietly to the master's intent. He thought of the mistakes of the open-hearted, the lives wasted by unchecked emotion. How many have been undone not by battle, but by their own transparent souls? One misstep, one trembling voice, one revealing gaze, and suddenly they were controlled by the currents they had once ignored. To master oneself was to rise above these currents, to observe them without being swept away. And in that rise, one discovers an almost sacred freedom. Freedom from manipulation, from chaos, from the relentless pressure of expectation. Yet mastery is not coldness, nor is it detachment from life. On the contrary, it requires profound engagement with every pulse of feeling. One must see desire clearly, feel grief deeply, and know anger intimately. But all of it must be held, folded carefully into the strategy of living. To release it is a choice, a tool, a carefully aimed force. To suppress it until the moment serves is an act of self-possession, an exercise in quiet divinity. The master becomes a vessel for his own instincts, guiding them without letting them overwhelm, shaping them into silent influence. He understood that this mastery was not static. It was a living process, refined through experience and reflection. Every day offered tests, a heated word, a subtle provocation, a minor betrayal. Each could shatter a lesser man, yet he met them with the calm of one who had seen storms and moved through them untouched. Mastery is practiced in moments that no one notices, in battles fought inside the mind, in victories achieved without applause. It is the quiet throne upon which power sits, unseen, undeniable. The strongest men, he reflected, are not those who conquer with force. They are those who conquer themselves. The impulsive are weak. The unmeasured are prey. Those who master their hearts, their impulses, and their emotions become architects of their world, shaping events and guiding outcomes without a word. They are the men others follow instinctively, some with admiration, some with fear, but all with recognition of an unseen authority. And in this calm, he allowed himself a rare, private reflection. The journey had been long and lonely. The descent into understanding, the countless moments of restraint, the careful observation of every detail. They had exacted their price. Yet the price had not been bitter. It had been the forge upon which he had been shaped. To feel everything and reveal nothing had transformed fear into clarity, desire into strategy, and vulnerability into quiet authority. Mastery, he realized, was not an endpoint. It was a living, breathing presence. It required constant vigilance, reflection, and refinement. Yet it also offered a profound gift, the freedom to move through life untouched by the chaos that ensnares others. The currents of manipulation, the snares of ambition, the subtle pressures of human expectation, they could no longer bend him. He existed in a space between motion and stillness, visible yet imperceptible, engaged yet untouchable. And so, as the evening sky darkened and the soft glow of candlelight kissed the walls, he understood the ultimate truth. The journey from awakening, through descent, to mastery was complete. The world had not changed, but he had. He was no longer a man swayed by perception, nor a soul imprisoned by reaction. He was the quiet architect of influence, the master of concealment, the unseen force guiding currents without revealing himself. And in that mastery, he found freedom. True, unassailable, sacred freedom. As he closed his eyes, the weight of the world no longer pressed upon him. It moved around him, yielding, bending, and whispering its acknowledgement. He had learned to command without command, to influence without visibility, to master without spectacle. And in that quiet, he became untouchable, unseen, and above all, unstoppable. Whisper soft transition. And so, as the night deepened into silence, the lessons of a lifetime settled like a gentle tide. Mastery was no longer a pursuit. It was a presence, quiet, sovereign, and eternal, guiding each thought, each action, each heartbeat toward a horizon only he could navigate.